The typhoon rose on the horizon, not the way storms are usually born in the Pacific, not gradually, not with a worrying buildup of force, but all at once, in one monstrous lunge, as if the sky itself had split open and poured all its pent-up fury into the world. And when the USS Midway sounded the first alarm warning of a sudden collapse in weather, no one yet knew that this night would become the worst in the life of everyone serving aboard. Though within minutes the wind began to howl, as if thousands of invisible hands were tearing at the hull, and the waves leapt over the sides, turning the deck into a narrow, death-slick battlefield between man and sea. Several flights were in the air. Phantoms, A-6 intruders, A-7 corsairs, returning from night combat missions, and every pilot knew he had no choice. Above the clouds lay war, below them the ocean, and the only place where survival was possible was the carrier deck, shaking under the blows of the sea as the storm hurled the ship up and down like a small tin toy. Lieutenant Thomas "Hawk" Hadley, strapped into the cockpit of an F-18 Super Hornet, felt the aircraft becoming an extension of his nerves. Every vibration ran through his body. Every gust of wind echoed in his head like a warning that this night would test not only the machinery, but his will. Thomas had flown over the ocean for years, grown used to its wild unpredictability, but this time it felt as if the very air was trying to throw him off. The wind hit the wing in brutal jerks that made the instrument panel tremble, and rain streamed across the canopy in a solid wall, turning the cockpit into a sealed capsule cut off from the world. Only the crackle of the radio, filled with frightened yet painfully professional voices of other pilots, reminded him he wasn't alone in this breaking sky. "Midway, this is Phantom 12. I've got zero visual, no horizon line, requesting heading." "Hold on, 12. We've got you. Nobody stays in the air tonight." The words sounded confident, but Thomas could hear the strain behind them, heard the fear hiding in the voices of officers and pilots alike, the kind even the most experienced can't fully conceal when they realize a mistake here doesn't mean a reprimand or a lost assignment. A mistake here means death, a shattered aircraft, and a name that in a week will be etched on a metal plate beside dozens of others who once failed to reach those 300 meters of heaving deck. Thomas ran a hand across his cheek. It was wet, whether from sweat, condensation, or from the emotions that sometimes break through when a person understands he could disappear at any moment into millions of tons of water below. He forced himself to focus on the instrument panel, where the numbers jumped like irritated insects, and warning lights flashed and died in rhythm with the storm's violence. Below him the ocean frothed and exploded in white crests, each the size of a small house, and when the aircraft lurched especially hard, Thomas understood that this was no ordinary storm. This was a wall of chaos, where sky, sea, and wind had fused into one dark element, leaving no chance for anyone not paying absolute attention. But there was no choice. The fuel was dropping, the controller's voice was getting sharper, and in this blind darkness there was only one hope. A small carrier, bucking in the void, where rain-blinded, soaked men were already waiting on deck to catch those now flying between life and death. And Thomas thought, if there is a God, then let him be on our side tonight, even just a little.
At the moment when the storm finally locked the carrier in its iron embrace, the deck of the USS Midway became an arena where courage and fear were no longer opposites, but walked side by side, woven so tightly together that anyone standing under the open sky could no longer tell which was stronger, the desire to survive or the readiness to die for those still circling above the dark abyss of the ocean. And there, on that tiny patch of steel, battered by the wind and drowned in icy torrents of rain, stood LSO Mark Davenport, the man who would have to lead the pilots through hell. He stood on his platform, as if on the peak of a cliff amid storm-thrashed waves, and every new surge rising higher than a man's height made his muscles tighten and his fingers clamp harder around the rail just to stay upright, because the wind blew with such brutality it seemed determined to rip him from his post. But Mark did not move, did not take a single step back, because if he left that spot, if he yielded to the storm even for a moment, then dozens of pilots hanging in the black sky would be left without eyes, without ears, without the one person meant to guide them to safety. And that thought held him in place more firmly than any harness or guardrail. His protective poncho had long since stopped protecting anything. It clung to his skin, soaked so deeply it felt like an icy second hide. But Mark barely noticed the cold because all his attention was locked on the glow of the Fresnel lens, on the pulsing lights along the deck's edge, on the crackling radio where the pilots' voices sounded confident yet brittle, like people ready to fight to the end but fully aware their lives now hung from the vocal cords of one man. "Hawk, I've got you. You're coming in fine. But you're a little low, buddy. Bring it up about 5 feet. That's it. Good." Mark spoke calmly, but that calm cost him dearly. Every instruction required an instant evaluation, and he had to account not only for the aircraft's approach, but the rhythm of the waves, the strength of shifting gusts, and the violent lurching of the ship as it plunged and rose on the crests, like it was trying to throw off everyone standing on its back. Lightning tore across the sky, and for a heartbeat, Mark saw everything around him. The raging sea, long whip-like streams of water coursing down the deck, the silhouettes of deckhands barely staying on their feet, and, most important of all, the dark outline of an F-18 closing in, fighting what looked like invisible giants. Then a sharp voice burst into his headset. "Cable 3 is down. Repeat, the third cable is non-functional, washed out by a wave." The words hit Mark harder than any wind. Losing a cable meant every approach became twice as dangerous, and for pilots already exhausted, it could be a death sentence. The arresting gear was the heart of a carrier, the last thing standing between a pilot and disaster. He drew in a deep breath. The cold air burned in his lungs. "Copy. We're running on 2 and 4. Deck status?" "Ready, but hold steady. The waves are getting higher." Mark did not reply. He only clenched his jaw and lifted his gaze to the sky again, where for an instant the amber glow of the Fresnel lens vanished behind the sheets of rain, and he realized that this might become the hardest night of his life. And then, as if the storm itself wanted to test him, another massive wave slammed against the carrier's side. The entire deck shuddered, and the water exploded upward, crashing over the platform and burying Mark completely. For a second, he was blinded, deafened by the roar and the deluge of rain. And when he forced his eyes open, the world was blurred, as though seen through fogged glass. That was the moment Thomas's voice cut into the radio. A voice cracked, human, alive, afraid. "Mark! My instruments are jumping. I'm losing orientation. Damn it, I can't see the deck." Mark squeezed his eyes shut for a fraction of a second, then answered the way a man must answer when another life rests entirely in his hands, firmly, steadily, without a hint of doubt, as though storms did not exist. "Listen to me, Hawk. I'm your eyes. You're not going down. I'll bring you in. Don't trust the instruments, trust me." And in that moment, alone in the roaring darkness, Thomas heard something in Mark's voice that no machine could ever replace. Something human, alive, unbreakable. A promise. A promise given under pounding rain, amid the howling wind and the thunder of waves. "You will make it back. I won't let the storm take you."
At the moment Mark's voice broke through the static and the roar of the storm, Thomas felt his fingers on the stick loosen, not from relief, but from that strange confidence only a human voice can give in the midst of machines in fury. The cockpit instruments were still flashing red warnings, the aircraft still shaking as if caught in a giant web of wind. But Thomas nodded to himself, as though Mark could somehow see him through the miles of darkness and rain, and whispered into his mask,
Got you, brother. Take me home. Mark, standing on the platform that now felt like a wobbling raft on an ocean of rage, wiped his face with his sleeve, though the water streamed down endlessly. Mixing with salt from sweat and sea, he squinted into the night, where the F-18's lights flickered like distant embers, fighting gusts that could throw the aircraft off course at any second. He knew Thomas was one of the best, but the storm didn't care about rank or skill. It simply took whatever it could. And now, with waves rising higher and threatening to swamp even the carrier's stern, Mark understood. Every second was a roulette spin, with not only a pilot's life at stake, but his own conscience. If Thomas missed the arresting cable, if he overshot those cursed few meters, the blame would fall on him, the LSO who failed to anticipate one more lurch of the ship, or one more vicious gust. Hold heading 275, Hawk. You're on the line, but winds from the right, correct 2 degrees. That's it, good job, don't rush it, you've got fuel. The deck is waiting. Mark's voice was steady, taut like a drawn string. Inside him, though, a storm of his own raged, memories of nights when he'd lost friends. One jet swallowed by the ocean after a hydraulic failure, another simply vanishing into fog. And now, with the Midway pitching by tens of feet, Mark prayed the cables would hold, that the soaked, freezing deck crew wouldn't falter at the worst moment. He saw their silhouettes on the deck, men in yellow vests chained to the ship so the waves wouldn't sweep them overboard. And every one of them knew this wasn't a night for heroes, it was a night for survivors. Meanwhile, Thomas fought a machine that felt alive and stubborn. The F-18 swayed side to side, turbines screaming as they compensated for the gusts, and on the radar the deck appeared and vanished like a desert mirage. Except instead of sand, there was only water, merciless and black, ready to swallow anything that fell into it. He thought of his wife Emma waiting for him in San Diego, with their little son who was probably asleep, unaware his father was hanging between sky and hell. And the thought hit harder than the wind. Not today. I won't leave them alone. I've got lights, Thomas exhaled when lightning split the sky, revealing the carrier for a heartbeat as a silver shape on the boiling sea. Coming in! Mark nodded, though no one saw, and his heart pounded in rhythm with the crashing waves. He raised his paddles, the old-school but trusted tools in an age of electronics, and swept them through the air, guiding the approach. Higher, left, steady. The deck shuddered under another massive wave, water sloshing over his boots, but he stood firm, knowing everything depended on his voice. Then the jet emerged from the rain, a dark-shaped hurtling toward the deck, and Thomas felt the wheels strike at the exact moment the ship lifted on a towering swell. The hook caught the second cable. The jolt slammed him into his seat as the aircraft screeched across the slick deck, sparks and steam trailing behind, until it skidded to a stop just meters from the edge. "Cable caught!" someone shouted over the radio, and Mark finally allowed himself to exhale. But the relief lasted only a heartbeat. More aircraft still circled in the storm, and the tempest wasn't calming, it was growing, furious at losing one prize. Thomas climbed out of the cockpit into the downpour, his legs buckling as adrenaline drained away, leaving only exhaustion and trembling. When he reached the deck, Mark was already there, drenched like a wreck-shipped ghost, but smiling through the fatigue. "You almost killed me, Hawk," Mark slapped his shoulder, but in his eyes there was something deeper, a brotherhood forged in the storm. "You saved me," Thomas replied, pulling him into a brief rain-soaked embrace as alarms wailed, calling the next aircraft in. But the storm wasn't done, and the night was far from over. Somewhere above, more voices crackled through the darkness, and the ocean roared, promising new trials, new losses, new promises men make to each other when the world tries to tear them apart.
Thomas hadn't even stepped away from the gangway when Mark's headset erupted with the voice he'd been afraid of hearing all night. Mayday! Mayday! This is Corsair 30. Right engine's dying, losing thrust, altitude 1200 and dropping. The voice belonged to Lieutenant Kyle River, 26, a Texas kid everyone just called Riv. He was the last in the landing queue from his flight, the youngest, the liveliest, the one who always brought a guitar aboard and played Sweet Home Alabama while everyone else slept. Mark lunged toward the console, barely noticing the water lashing his face. Riv, talk to me. What's your fuel state? 400 pounds? Maybe less? I can't see anything, Mark. It's all black. Thomas was already there beside him, still in a soaked flight suit, still trembling, but no longer from cold. He grabbed a spare headset from the nearest tech and jumped onto the channel. Riv, this is Hawk. Listen carefully. Do everything the LSO tells you. Breathe. You're home. You hear me? Only heavy breathing and static answered him. Then a quiet, almost childlike, I don't want to die, guys. Those words hit harder than any wave. Mark felt something knot inside him. He knew he couldn't falter. Not now. Riv, heading 275, descend to 800 feet. I've got you on radar. You're 3 miles out. Hold 135 knots, flaps 20, gear up. You'll land on one engine. We'll catch you on the second wire. You're going to be fine. He was lying. He knew it. With one engine, in this turbulence, with the third arrestor cable already torn out, the odds were almost zero. But telling the truth now would kill the kid before the ocean did. On deck, the crew worked like the damned. Someone was hauling a new arrestor cable by hand, a steel line, wet, heavy, slipping in their palms. Someone shouted to move Thomas's F-18 out of the landing area. Someone else was praying out loud, ashamed of nothing. Lightning split the sky again, and for a heartbeat they all saw it. The A-7 Corsair, alone, a dark trail of smoke from its right engine, flying low, far too low, skimming the wave crests. Riv, bring the nose up! Nose up, damn it! Mark shouted, waving his paddles as if he could physically lift the aircraft. Thomas grabbed Mark's shoulder. He's too low. If he tries for the deck now, he'll miss and go straight into the water. I know, Mark breathed, his voice cracking for the first time that night. At that moment, the Corsair surged upward. Riv had heard him. The plane leveled out, but too late. The carrier had just dropped into a trough between waves, the deck falling 25 feet in a single second. Wave off! Wave off! Mark roared, but he knew it was pointless. Riv didn't have enough fuel for another pass. And then something happened that no one expected. Riv didn't turn toward the deck. He leveled his aircraft parallel to the carrier's hull, just 10 meters above the water, flew along the starboard side, and the instant the ship began to rise on the next swell, Riv pulled hard on the stick and drove into the ocean 100 meters aft the stern. No attempt to eject, no attempt to save himself. The explosion was brief, an orange flash, a column of steam and fire swallowed by the next wave. The silence on the radio was worse than any scream. Mark stood there, paddles still raised, unable to lower his arm. Thomas stared at the place where the plane had vanished and felt something tear inside him, slowly, painfully, beyond repair. One of the deck crew muttered a curse and started crying openly, and the storm kept howling as if laughing. Mark finally lowered the paddles. His voice was hoarse but steady. All flights, recoveries suspended until further notice. Anyone with fuel left, divert to Guam or Okinawa. That's an order. He switched off his mic so no one would hear what he added barely audibly. I'm sorry, kid. I wasn't fast enough. Thomas put a hand on his shoulder. They stood together in the rain, which now felt bitter, as if the sky itself was crying in their place. That night, USS Midway lost one pilot, and everyone who remained understood, sometimes even the strongest cable can't hold someone the sea has already chosen.
The storm laughed as suddenly as it had arrived. Somewhere between 4 and 5 in the morning, the wind sighed out, the waves subsided, and the sky over the Pacific turned gray and heavy. No longer hostile, just tired. Only the sea kept grumbling for a while, rocking the carrier as if to remind them, I let you live. For now. The flight deck was chaos. Shredded arrestor cables, torn antennas, scraps of fuselage ripped off by the waves. Everything glistened with salt and seawater. People walked slowly, as if afraid to wake the dead. Thomas stood at the edge of the deck, at the very spot where Riv had disappeared just hours earlier. In his hands was his helmet, the one he never put back on. He stared eastward, where the horizon was beginning to pale, and for the first time that night he felt that the sun really was going to rise. Mark approached without a sound. In his hands were 2 mugs of coffee. Real coffee. Someone had found a can in the galley and brewed it right on the stove. Rules be damned. They took the mugs silently, drank the bitter, scalding liquid. 19 recoveries. 18 alive. 1 didn't make it. You did everything you could. I told him, you're home. And he died 100 meters from home. Thomas said nothing. There was nothing to argue. Below, on the hangar deck, they were already packing Riv's things. Someone gently placed his guitar into its case. Someone set down a photograph beside it. Kyle with his parents on their ranch, cowboy hat on, smiling like the whole world belonged to him. The deck crew carried the box in silence, the way you carry a coffin. The captain announced a moment of silence over the ship-wide PA. The entire bulk of the Midway went still. Even the engines deep below seemed to quiet down. When it was over, Mark suddenly said, "You know what he told me yesterday before launch? If I don't come back, play Freebird at my funeral, the whole 10-minute version, so nobody has time to get bored." Idiot. His voice cracked on the last word. Thomas nodded. We'll play it. All of it. The sun finally tore itself free from the horizon, thin and red, as if embarrassed to shine on a day like this. It lit up the deck, and for the first time that night, people saw each other's faces. Tired, ash gray, but alive. Thomas set his empty mug on the rail and pulled a small folding knife from his pocket, the one Riv had given him for Christmas, with a hawk carved in the handle. He stepped to the starboard side, where the waves had stripped the paint and carved 3 letters into the steel. R-I-V. Simple, permanent. Mark watched the blade scrape the metal, and for the first time that night, allowed himself to cry. Short, silent, hoping no one would notice. But Thomas noticed. He simply placed a hand on Mark's shoulder, just like he had in the rain. At 06:17 ship's time, USS Midway turned onto a new course. Home. A flag was raised on the bridge. Someone near the stern switched on a recording. A guitar. The long, stretching intro of Freebird. And as the carrier headed east toward the sunrise, the voice of someone no longer alive spread over the ocean, and those who remained stood on deck and listened to the very end, all 10 minutes and 23 seconds, because they had promised. The sea was silent. It had taken what it wanted, and they were returning, alive, broken, but still together. And in the end, that was enough.